Hello, everybody. Welcome back. You're listening to The Origination Point. My name is Bill De La Cruz, and I'm your host today. And so glad that you are choosing to join us. If this content resonates with you, just like, subscribe, and you will be able to be hit up every time we drop a new episode. And for many of you who've been listening, I talk a lot about bias and stereotypes and judgments and a lot of the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. And I think for many of us in these spaces, what we usually talk about are issues related to race or gender or sexuality or religion. And we don't always think about people with disabilities. And so my guest today, uh, Alison Hayes, is going to take us on a little bit of a journey um, that, from her perspective, is called Thriving While Disabled. And we're going to talk about some of this. People with disabilities and how they are impacted, and also how many people are thriving, and really do our best to more mainstream this conversation, where we're moving it out of just talking about DEI from the perspective of what we see, because some of the disabilities that we're talking about are things that you can't see. And so I'm really excited for our conversation today. And we're just going to jump right in because Alice and I already started back in the green room talking about this. So, Allison, welcome. It's really great to have you here today. How are you doing?
It's wonderful to be here. I'm doing pretty well. A little symptomatic, but that's to be expected.
Yep.
So
You can share
I
that
am
more with our listeners.
ab- absolutely. So I am a cis and bi woman with with multiple disabilities, and I also am wearing multicolored glasses and have brown hair that's a bit over shoulder length. I like to get used to describing visually because that's very important for the blind members of the audience in particular. Um, it's a good habit to get into. Anyway,
That's something I
so
never really thought about. So I'll have
yeah,
to think about that.
visual, like just like it's important. Oh yeah, I use she, her
Okay.
pronouns. Um, and so that's another piece of the DEI puzzle, actually. I've seen some people pull it in, but not enough.
Hmm.
Visual descriptions for blind members or low vision members of the audience, and things like that. So, anyway,
Great.
introduction.
Well, I mean, it's great because even for somebody like me who's been doing this a long time, I'm learning something new already. So that's great.
Absolutely. So, I got my first disability diagnosed, my first diagnosis, so to speak, when I was about 3, and was diagnosed with a mild learning disability and gross motor
Mm.
issues. So basically, that translates into, at that time, I couldn't fully control how my body worked and couldn't always coordinate all of my limbs. I went through a lot of like physical therapy and retraining at that time with my mom. And by the time I started attending school, it had been downgraded, so to speak. I'd adapted enough that it was considered a fine motor disability, which in my case basically has translated into really terrible handwriting and not the best like hand-eye coordination at times.
Can I ask you what
And
kind of things you went through at that young age so that by the time you got to school, it had, I guess, downgraded itself a little bit?
I don't know much of it,
Okay.
uh, but basically, my understanding is my mom met with people from a local university who were doing evaluations with young children, and they gave her a series of exercises, which I know included like playing with Play-Doh
Mm.
and probably I know from other experiences that like doing physical activities like dancing helps reintegrate the parts,
Okay.
things like that. But I don't know exactly what my mom had to do with me at that time.
Okay.
Um, but and this was also in the early 80s,
Right.
so I'm sure the um, the therapies have improved dramatically since then.
Great.
Um, so when I started school, I had the label of disabled, but didn't really think about it or identify that way. I just knew that mom and I had played those games, and I'd gotten,
Mhm.
and she'd also like taken me to like reading is fundamental. I had people visit me from there and encouraged me to learn. And I'd had some kind of evaluation and got very high scores related to intelligence at a very young age. And I was like, okay, cool. And at school, I had an IEP, and basically, in order to have untimed tests, which was the accommodation for my learning
Mhm.
disability, and to have the ability to use a computer to take notes as I got older, due to my handwriting being so terrible, I couldn't read it. So I would type on a computer instead. My dad taught me to type by the age of 6.
Wow.
Um, yeah, and this was before there were really laptops.
So you had
This was
those
when
big
you
computers.
No, my parents found this little tiny thing. It was called a Z88, and it was basically a keyboard with a 4-line screen on it.
Oh, okay.
And so I'd sit there and type into it. I'm sure it cost a small fortune then and has nowhere near the power of anything now.
Yep.
But you know, but it was a thing that I could use. And for years and years and years, I'd sit in my class and take my notes on my computer, which nobody had, and really marked me out as other.
Yeah, and I just want to explain to our listeners who don't know, an IEP is an individual education plan that students get when they have some type of an accommodation that they need for
Right.
a variety of reasons. So I just want to,
Mhm.
when we use acronyms,
Uh,
I like to explain it because not everybody knows what those things are.
no, absolutely. Disability related topics,
Yep.
basically, there's two educational supports,
Yep.
which are the IEPs, and then there's the 504 protections, which is basically for people with usually physical disabilities, but to make sure that they participate in the classroom as much as possible.
Yep.
So 504 is what lets them make sure that people using wheelchairs can get to their classes and things like that. So it's got the
Great.
physical participation, where IEP is the educational part.
Yeah, and then when we move
Um,
out of education, it's the ADA that it allows for
protects.
that protection and compliance in businesses and things like that. So
Right. And that's
I know that's probably a
unfortunate.
whole other conversation.
Yes. The brief part is it's broken, but it's much, much better than nothing. And it's much better than what most countries have.
Yes, that's
So,
true. Okay. Well, we won't go there too
so
much today.
no, no. But yeah. So um, I didn't, and at 9, I was diagnosed with depression.
Okay.
I was really fortunate in that my mom had a history with depression and was able to recognize it in me pretty quickly, even though I was so young, and took me to therapy. I started taking antidepressants, and I eventually got things under control. Fast forward, um, college, same kind of thing. I didn't really identify as disabled, though, until a year or two after college, when I finally was diagnosed with a condition called functional neurological disorder, or FND. That is the reason that I am collecting Social Security disability insurance, and that is um, the condition that really forced me to recognize that part of my identity.
Mm.
Um, Despite all those years of having the mental health diagnosis, of having the physical diagnoses, I looked at the label of disabled as a very, very negative
Yep.
thing, and I didn't want it, and it wasn't me. I just was a little different.
And I think that's societal also, that
Oh, very
label
much.
of disabled, probably the first thing that people think about is not something in the positive. And so I think that's
No.
why these conversations are so important.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in fact, when you think about it, even the label of disability and disabled, so many people are afraid to use it,
Mm-hmm.
are afraid, and are looking for a better term. And that idea of a better term is so destructive, and it's a recognition of just how severe our societal ableism is. We even look at the neutral descriptor as a negative thing.
Mm-hmm. Because it's hard for me to
So,
say. I think that's part
mhm.
of it. Is it's not only that societal discrimination, it's also kind of egotist in some way, because if I don't like to say it, then let's rename it, which is what we're seeing happen with all of this language today. And
Oh,
so because people
yeah.
want to make it either benign or something that feels good, when it's hard to make that feel good, because it's real for people. People with disabilities is real, and you can say that.
Oh, absolutely. And the other part of it is using other terms, including like differently abled, which some people have embraced, and special needs,
Mm-hmm.
which there's a huge argument within the disability community about that, as well as person first versus identity first
Mm-hmm.
language.
Because
Um,
I've learned person first.
right. So basically, okay. So yeah, with person first language, um, the most common and commonly accepted term that's like universally a-okay is like people of color.
Right.
The point is they're people first, and so
Right.
many people in society have forgotten that we have to remind them.
Right. Right.
And identity first is the language we normally use, where it's just disabled person
Hmm.
or things like that. So within the disability community, the divide tends to be um, people in the developmental and intellectual disability spaces, and other people whose disabilities are so visible and or severe, their family members tend to advocate for them and push for that person first language.
Okay.
And then there's other people within the community, especially like within the autism community and other people who are in the neurodiverse area, and others of us who are somewhere in between, feel that why should we try to make a big deal out of our identity and make it this special thing? And so we're like, no, identity first. I'm a disabled person.
Hmm. Okay. So even
I actually,
within the larger disabled community, there's not, this is how we're gonna, this is what we're gonna call it. There's always that level of perspective.
oh, absolutely.
Okay.
And it's important to know that because we're actually the largest minority in this country, and probably globally, we're one of
Hmm.
the largest minorities. According to the CDC, 27% of this country has a disability of some
Wow.
sort.
And it's
Yeah.
interesting because, a lot of the work I do in spaces are people like, well, I don't know what to say. Like, I don't know what to call them. And them could be anybody from a racial, religious, disabled perspective. And it's probably real, because even within all of these communities, it's like the names change or the acronyms change. And it's hard to keep up. It's hard for me to keep up with them. And I'm in the space.
Yeah, and it's partially because there is this conversation and disagreement.
Hmm.
And the other part is ableism is so deeply ingrained in our society that it's very hard to have a mindset that isn't ableist.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
very, even a lot of disabled people have a lot of ableist messages that we tell ourselves. There's also a really big, there's also a bit of a divide between people who were born or really early diagnosed with a disability and people who become disabled as they get older.
Okay.
And I'm not even talking like older. I'm talking like when you have a definitive mental image of your before and after,
Hmm.
that in itself is really traumatic.
Okay. So like when you're born and things are fine and then you're 10 years old and then boom, this big shift comes, then it
Right.
plays a pretty big emotional and whatever type of role based on the disability.
Right.
Okay.
And and it doesn't necessarily matter in that sense what the disability is or what caused it.
Right.
The point is you have a mental before the event and
Got
after
it.
the event.
Okay. So the most obvious one would be I'm a sighted person and then something happens when I'm 12 and I lose my sight and all of a sudden even though I can't
Right.
see in my head I have this image of myself before
Right.
and after and what I'm hearing you say is that plays a role.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
It impacts your perspective on disability. It
Hmm.
impacts how you think about yourself. It impacts um, kind of how you process it, I think.
So do you have an example of what a even from your own experience what a ableist message or mindset would be in your head even knowing that you have any kind of a disability?
Oh, yeah. The most common is I'm a burden, I'm a
Oh, okay.
failure, I can't do anything right, or it takes me too long,
Hmm.
things like that.
Okay.
And that's common for most types of disabilities simply because we have fewer usable hours in the day.
Sure.
Um, in some cases, it's because of a physical limitation. So it literally takes longer to use the bathroom or take a shower or things like that. For other people, like dealing with mental health conditions, it's very often I have to take an extra hour or two out of my day to keep myself stable,
Yeah.
or I need to have these practices that I'm doing so that I don't have a problem later. Or something happens and triggers symptoms, and then
Hmm.
you need hours or days to like restabilize and get things back. But almost all disabilities have some degree of that
Okay.
limitation sequence.
Yeah, and if you don't understand it, you'd be like, what's wrong with them? Versus
Right.
how do I support this person, whether it's a workmate or a homemate? So, okay.
No, absolutely. And because we've all been given ableist messaging all our
Right.
lives, it's really hard to reprogram. For a for a percentage of of parents with children who are diagnosed as disabled, they're once they embrace that their child has a disability, they're usually, if they're not too ableist, protective and go into how do I protect my child and
Yeah.
how do I support my child.
Yeah.
But if you're an adult, especially who becomes disabled, everybody knew you before. And now you're not who you were. And they have to grieve that loss and you have to grieve that loss.
Yeah. So there's a whole process just in
And
that piece.
oh, absolutely. And I didn't really recognize any of that until my F&D kicked in. And it's a weird condition that's right in the middle of like neurology and psychiatry. And so nobody wanted it.
Okay.
Basically, at the time, I was really fortunate, even just to be diagnosed.
So could
I
you
found
tell
out.
us, even myself included, what
Yep.
that actually means and what cognitively is happening to you?
Yes. So, functional neurological disorder basically is a disruption in brain function when some kind of trigger happens.
Okay.
And yes, that's vague, but that's because the symptoms are so wide and so varied. Basically, a person with FND can have any neurological symptom or set of neurological symptoms in response to whatever their triggers are.
Yeah.
So, in my case, I'm especially sensitive to emotional stress. And so, any form of emotional stress will often trigger my symptoms. And that's literally like being excited to be on this show. I'm having mild symptoms
Okay.
where my hand is kind of forming into a little claw
Okay.
and things like that.
So is it?
In my case,
Oh, go ahead.
hmm?
Go ahead.
In my case, it's muscle movements and muscle control that's
Okay.
most impacted.
Okay.
So I started with things like rocking back and forth, um, slamming the trunk of my body into something I was sitting in or anything that was behind me,
Hmm.
um, limping, dragging a leg behind me, um, losing losing control. I had a point where I lost control of my legs and so if I tried to use stairs, my legs would collapse at
Oh.
some point, and the anxiety over that possibility made it much more likely to happen. And so I couldn't safely climb stairs for about
Hmm.
a year and a half actually, before I found a treatment program and went through that process. And fortunately, it really helped my movement symptoms. Unfortunately, it triggered some new symptoms, which is pretty unusual.
So the neurological part is that I get triggered and then it affects something in my body through my brain that I don't necessarily have control over. Is that, am I getting
Right. And
that?
you have
Okay.
no right. And your brain basically just picks a symptom
Uh-huh.
and then sticks with it or varies if you do enough therapy to treat it. So,
Okay.
like in my case, I happen to have one of the more common forms, which is functional movement disorder.
Okay.
So, I have all of these weird movement and muscle symptoms, and there's nothing wrong with any of my muscles. Every single muscle works fine. But my brain every once in a while just is like, hey, you're a claw now. Or hey, you're going to limp now,
Yeah.
or whatever. And just tells a muscle or muscle group, no, you're not going to do what I just told you to do. But other people with FND have functional blindness or functional seizures, so non epileptic seizures. I mean, pretty much any neurological symptom out there, with the exception of migraines, because they're already 100% in your head.
Yes.
Um,
Okay.
Pretty much any other neurological symptom set somebody with FND might have. So, one of the big problems is differentiating it from the other conditions out there. So, like, there's some people whose FND exhibits in like semi paralysis on one side.
Hmm.
They slowly get, and their improvement is, oh, I can use my leg now, but my arm still won't work.
So it's
Or,
basically that there's not like a consistent way that it shows up, and it's
not
one
at
of
all.
those things. If I were to see you all calm somewhere, I'd be like,
You'd have
what
no
is she
idea.
talking about? A disability.
Right.
So unless I
Exactly.
spent time with you, I might not see anything. And I think that's the challenge with some of these. Um, I'll just call it an unseen disability because you may not
Well,
even know how to process it.
the the word that's kind of most that people are working on getting more accepted
Okay.
is non-apparent disability.
Non-apparent. Okay, that makes more sense. So rather than
It used to,
unseen, we would say
right,
non-apparent. Okay.
because once you get to know an individual person with an individual disability,
Hmm.
you can start to recognize when they're having a rough
Sure.
day.
Okay.
So, like somebody with migraines, you meet them on the street, you don't know. But if you live with them or work with them regularly, you'll see a squint, or they've got a big cup of coffee and they normally don't. Or there's there's things that signal
So that would
that they're
be
having a
like
rough.
anxiety would be one of those non-apparent
Mhm.
unless you were with
Oh,
somebody
absolutely.
enough to recognize, oh boy, you're just getting triggered. I can tell.
Right.
Let's go for a walk or I'll just be quiet. So,
E-
okay.
Exactly. And I probably and a large percentage of disabilities are actually non-apparent disabilities. I think I read something suggesting that only 30% of
Hmm.
disabilities are the really obvious apparent ones. So there's a huge percentage of the disability population that get that pass as
Right.
abled.
Right. And it's interesting because it makes me
Um,
think about with that passing how many places and spaces that they work in or go into where they either can't ask for or there's no ability to provide an accommodation because people will
Oh,
say, "Oh no,
absolutely.
you pass," or "You look okay."
Well, yeah, and that's one of the big problems. There's a lot of, you look okay to me.
Right.
Okay, that's great. You're only seeing me on the good days.
Right.
The reason I'm not coming in on this other day is because I can't. Or, a lot of people have flare ups. Disability is a very dynamic thing
Mm-hmm.
for most people.
Mm-hmm.
We have good days and bad days. And on a good day, you can go into work and do the things. And on a bad day, you really can't. And sometimes you do it anyway, which leads to a flare and makes things worse.
Right.
So there's a lot going on within it. Um, yeah.
And it's really true. I mean, I do a lot of mediation work, and I've done mediations with folks who have told me all of these
Mhm.
anxiety and depression things that they have, and realize that the stress of their job is their trigger.
Yep.
And so, in some
Yep.
cases, they have to leave that particular job because it's so demanding that, in a normal person, our stress level is like this. And in somebody who's got that
I've got
stress,
a
it peaks
correction.
up.
I've got a correction for you there too.
Okay.
Abled.
Say that again.
For an
For an
abled.
able person, it's like this. Okay. Gotcha.
Yep.
For an
Yep.
able person, it's like this. So, what is it for somebody who has a disability?
It depends on the disability
Okay.
and the triggers, but basically for a person with a disability, if an abled person is normally like here,
Yeah.
a disabled person's going to be their baseline's about there, lower, and then they'll just sink down really deep whenever they hit
Okay.
a flare or a new symptom. And the other thing is, a lot of people with chronic conditions collect them, not intentionally, but a lot of times when one chronic condition occurs, basically that's the body going slightly wrong. And over the time of managing that, it's more likely that something else is going to go slightly wrong in the body,
Hmm.
and then something else and something else. You can have this ripple effect, especially if you're continuing to put your body or brain or both through extra large scale stresses.
Okay. It's fascinating to learn all of this. And what I want our listeners to listen for and our viewers is that when I say something and Allison corrects me, I just say, "Oh, okay, I get that." So, because a lot of times people will say, "No, no, no, it's more this terminology or more shows up this." And this isn't about a debate or arguing. It's like, what's a way that we can create some common understanding and common language around disabilities so that we can actually have these conversations. And I think in a lot of the workplaces that I do work in, that's missing because they either don't have the ability or they don't see it. And and it changes the whole dynamic of that person's day, and the organization doesn't realize that they're the trigger. So,
Oh, and even just getting a job is
mm-hmm,
often extra challenging with a disability,
mm-hmm,
because a lot of job applications are less accessible than you'd think. Um, you a lot of times people are dependent on their social networks to get the jobs,
right,
and part of the ableism in society is that a lot of abled people end up falling out of contact or not staying in touch or drifting away from their disabled friend or family member or coworker, because part of what we're trained by society to do is if somebody's sick, you leave them alone for a while so they can get better.
right,
If you're really closely connected to them, okay, maybe you're the one bringing them soup or something.
right.
But in general, it's leave them alone, and when they get better, they'll come back. And
It's
that's
not
not how disability
right,
works. But a lot of us conflate having a chronic illness or being disabled with being sick.
Yeah, it's like people that I have a relationship with and I know have anxiety. I can tell when they're elevated, and I know that I need to either be quiet or step away and just come back when they've de escalated to a point where we can have more of a functional relationship. Because sometimes I don't even know what triggers them, and it might have been something I said. So that's different than what I'm hearing you say, where some people will just, well, let me go away, and then when you get better, I'll come back, and that's like not always the case.
Well, yeah, and it's just I've experienced, and so many people with disabilities talk about the social isolation that we
Mm-hmm.
end up with.
Mm-hmm.
And a big part of that is the structural ableism that we're facing
Yeah.
every day, because a lot of people are uncomfortable. They don't know what to say. So
Yeah.
they don't say anything. And then they don't talk, and then they back away.
Right.
And when you have an invisible illness, it feels more personal in a lot of ways, because with a very apparent condition, people see the thing that signals the disability and consciously decide I'm going to approach them or I'm not.
Right.
And so you're rejected. You're rejected before you have a relationship.
Yep. Because people are unsure, especially in today's
Right.
society. If I say the wrong thing, what's going to happen?
Right. And that's not comfortable and that's not nice, but at least you have the knowledge that it was definitely, they saw something about you and decided not to engage.
Right.
Where when you have a non apparent condition, people approach you assuming you're able,
Right.
and assuming you're going to do all of the things that they do, and of course you can, and make all kinds of assumptions um, that don't include, hey, I can't walk that far
Right.
because it's too fatiguing or too painful, or hey, I can't eat that food because I am severely allergic to it and it could kill me, or hey,
Any number of
the
things.
of things that disabled people have to navigate all the time, every day.
Yep.
And that process is tiring and sucks energy too.
So let me ask you this, just maybe a little bit of a shift. A lot of people today are talking about mindset, about how mindset is
Mhm.
so important and the narratives that we have about our mindset. What role does mindset play in something like you're talking about, which is a neurological disorder? And I'm just curious what you think about that, because I mean, the basic premise of mindset is that what I have in my narratives is what shows up in my world. And I'm wondering if that's similar, different, or what your thoughts are on that.
It's actually really fascinating. People with FND are extremely sensitive to the placebo effect,
Huh. Okay.
which is both good and bad. So, with the so like the way this like manifests is, if the person with FND really believes that a treatment will help them, it may, even though it doesn't happen the way it works. Like
Hmm.
an example that I remember reading was this. There was somebody who was prescribed like an injection, and they know from all their research and the standard treatment process that it takes 3 hours for it to take effect.
Okay.
The person with FND was given that injection, and 45 minutes later, they're feeling great and they're so thrilled with how well it worked.
Huh.
It's not physically possible for it to have had that effect, and yet they definitely showed improvement. It just wasn't from the medicine, it was from the belief that the medicine would help.
Interesting.
And most a good percentage of people are prone to the placebo effect, but it's just as a category, FNDers are very susceptible. So I actually try
So
to
is that
use that.
conscious or is that unconscious? Or is it a little bit of both?
It's
That placebo
yeah,
effect.
It's the placebo effect itself is subconscious.
Okay.
Basically, it's utilizing ritual and belief to manifest the effect you're looking for.
Okay.
For people, and it usually doesn't work when somebody is conscious of the process. It usually is something that works when somebody just has the belief.
Okay.
Like it's part of why doctors used to give B12 injections to patients. Sometimes it really helped them, and other times they felt better just because the doctor gave them a shot.
Right. Okay.
You
Interesting.
know, it's that kind of thing, and so you can try to harness that in your self improvement and self care process. And so, like for me, um, I tend to I meditate, meditations and altered state of
Hmm.
consciousness, and there has been a good amount of evidence that meditation helps with many conditions, but it's viewed as especially useful with FND, as one of the few useful treatments for FND, because it's a way to enter that altered state of consciousness, which has a lot of similarities to when FND symptoms kick
Hmm.
in. So it's getting your brain into and out of this altered state of consciousness space, which might help your brain get unstuck a little bit.
So you could actually, as you practice meditation, you could be in that space where you're triggered and use that practice to reground, so to speak.
Well, you can't consciously use it, but you're retraining your brain
Okay.
so that it's more apt to readjust more quickly
Okay.
or handle it better. And the same thing actually goes for the hypnosis process, which is kind of, if you look at the spectrum, meditation and hypnosis are opposite ends of the same spectrum.
Okay.
They're both they're both altered states of consciousness. It's just meditation is about this, what's happening right now. Let me be introspective and look at myself or focus on the outside world, where hypnosis is I have a goal and a purpose, and I'm going to use that visualization process to make that closer to reality.
Okay. Well, we could just dive into any of these topics for hours. So, how do you stay motivated and committed to your own growth, even when you're going through challenging times? I mean, I
Well,
think
for me,
meditation is one.
yeah. Um, when I have the energy, I also try to go the other direction with some hypnosis. Um, I actually do, like, the interesting thing with the meditation was I had to really change my mindset around it. When I first started
Mm,
meditating, I would just get so upset and frustrated because as soon as I would let myself relax that little bit, I get very symptomatic. I'd start rolling around, shaking, whole nine yards. And so I meditate in my bed for safety reasons.
okay, makes sense.
And then part of my meditation practice is accepting my movements the
Mm,
same way you accept your breath and the same way you accept the sounds around you. The movements themselves are just part of the world's input, and they're not something I can or will try to control. I just have to let them happen. And the beginning of my meditation process is usually pretty violent, I guess, for want of a better word. I'm rolling around or my legs are kicking
mm,
or various things. And I had to train myself to just be like, yep, that's okay. That is part of the process. But it means I have to be very picky about what meditations I use because so many of them have the abled assumption
right,
that stillness
right.
is your natural beginning point and that staying relatively still is just an effort of will rather
Hmm.
than
Okay.
a challenging process.
Yeah, well, that explanation, I could see how structural ableism is even built into a meditation process. So, if you found somebody who does meditation who has what you're talking about, where the movement
Um,
is just a part of the process?
Not specifically.
Okay.
What I've found more is I focus on a lot of meditation sequences that focus on emotions or pain,
Okay.
because those usually are much less concerned about your positioning or your body's physical reactions. It's usually more like get yourself in a comfortable space rather than sit upright, have your,
Right. Put your hands down,
head
sit up
straight and your head
straight.
up.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Because
Which is the
I can't
majority
sit.
of meditations, actually. I don't
Yeah.
think
So
I've
it's,
listened to one where it started out with just do whatever gyrations your body feels like, and then we'll start
yeah.
meditating. It's mostly sit up straight, put your feet on the floor, ground yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And,
interesting.
so, I've had to, pick through my options and either ignore those instructions in the beginning, which is very hard and somewhat frustrating to do,
Right.
or find the ones that go that direction. Another big tool was actually mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is really recommended for a lot of people with FND, and that's meditation and mindfulness combined with like kind of pain management strategies, where you separate the different layers because pain, and honestly the way my symptoms work under a very similar structure, that pain experience isn't really the big problem. The bigger problem is all of the ways that you think about it. Oh, my ankle hurts. Oh, since my ankle hurts, can I actually go for the walk today? Oh, if I can't go for the walk, I can't get exercise. I am failing at exercise. I'm not taking care of myself. And it can turn into like a catastrophizing type thing,
Even
including
though
can I
even
ever.
though you just have a sore ankle that day, the
Right,
mind takes it to these places of this is kind of the worst thing that could happen because it has this ripple effect.
right. And it's varying degrees, but like for a lot of people with disabilities, a lot of pieces of that are very, very real
Hmm.
because we've had.
Yeah.
So, like, for me, I have, you know, on a good day, I'm not symptomatic all day. But there's other days I wake up and I'm like limping around my apartment. And sometimes I know why and sometimes I don't. And so part of my treatment and self care process is let's solve the mystery of why I'm symptomatic. The more stresses I'm dealing with, the more likely I am
Yeah.
to have movement syndrome.
How
Uh,
feeling
wh-
through our
hmm?
podcast conversation?
And well, and you've noticed, or you might have noticed, I'm less symptomatic
Uh-huh.
because I'm distracted
Okay.
by our conversation.
Okay.
Those moments of fear or anxiety or oh my god, I'm doing this thing. That's what triggers the symptoms.
Got it. So if you
Where
keep
having the
focused on doing it, it's more enabling than if you think about doing it. Okay.
right,
Okay.
exactly,
Interesting.
and it's any form of stress. And at this point, I've been dealing with my FND for over 20 years,
Okay.
and so it's evolved to being sensitive to all forms of stress. And so I just have to kind of handle it by recognizing, naming, and moving on. Oh, I'm symptomatic because it's hot today. Oh, I'm symptomatic because I'm feeling cold. Oh, I'm tired. Oh, it's all of those
Hmm.
things. And there's times I'm more sensitive and less. I mean, while managing all of this, um, I still decided to go and succeeded in going to graduate school.
Hmm.
I
Awesome.
got a master's in organizational change management, which is part of what's informed my perspective on things. And that's why a part of why I ended up creating the blog I did and doing the work I do.
So let's
Um,
shift into talking about that. Like, what are you focusing on for future growth? I know you're working on a book. I know. So why don't you let's talk about some of those things that you're doing to help inform people.
okay, so I'm writing a book right now It's actually written. I'm going through the editing
Okay.
process. It will hopefully be out. It should be out before the end of the year, hopefully by November. And it's called Thriving While Disabled, Navigating Disability Finances.
Okay.
Um, and that's because a very large percentage of the disability population is poor,
Hmm.
um, especially even if they're working full time, if they're employed full time and working and all of that, there's still extra expenses that their abled peers don't have.
Yeah.
And so they're proportionally poor. They have less of their income is usable because of managing their condition, or they can work few hours, or they have less of a social life, etc. There's always a price that we as a community are
Hmm.
paying. Um, the other part is all of the disability programs in this country, other than the ADA laws themselves, push disabled people towards or into poverty. Um, for example, I'm on SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance. I'm collecting my retirement benefit. I've been collecting my retirement benefits since I was in my early 20s,
Okay.
because my condition keeps me from working. Before my FND symptoms kicked in, I was a full time college student, part time job, worked two jobs, and worked a full time job in the summer and volunteered. I was a very, very active worker. And my symptoms led to me losing multiple jobs. Um, and then I had to like completely reboot my life. And I shifted into, I went from marine biology to geographic information systems. And uh, because it was less dangerous for me to work with computers than it was for me to be out in the wild.
Okay.
Um, but I couldn't work more than part time doing that because of fatigue and symptoms and all of
Hmm.
that. And I had to reboot again um, when I decided to go to grad school. My initial plan had actually been to build a GIS consulting business, and I'd started that process. But when I was in grad school, that ate all my energy
Hmm.
and left me in much worse shape, triggered a lot of symptoms. I had to take a year off partway through, the whole 9 yards. And so by the time I got out, I had to totally reboot my life. And what I ended up doing about 2 years later, because my partner experienced a severe injury, which triggered another large symptom flare. Um, as he healed and I healed, I ended up deciding to create the blog Thriving While Disabled, which is basically a set of tools and conversations to help people look at life through a positive disability lens and to help people get a realistic picture of how the systems, both social and governmental, work and fail to work,
Hmm.
and help people like understand how to get through it with their mental health as intact as possible.
Yeah,
Um, and
and as you say, like I'm just going to read some of the titles for you listening. Pacing, an essential tool for self-care and healing. So I got COVID-19, experiencing the after effects, returning to work after getting on disability, protecting your health, using hypnotherapy to treat FND, transforming your mind. So really you're really looking at more positive, here's the things that we can actually do. And and so with your book, is it about being more functional financially, or is it strategies to set up being financially stable?
it's more about financial and emotional stability.
Okay.
it basically started with letting people know that we live in an ableist society.
Hmm.
That's why this all feels so hard.
Yeah.
And I go into it, a kind of a deep dive into what are interactions with, like, the classism, the ableism, the history of how disability and inability to work have been just completely intertwined, since the early history of this country, and just help people get that grounding of, no, this is hard. Yes, you're going to have losses.
Hmm.
This is not your fault.
Because I don't think able-bodied people realize that. I've done some work with organizations around the country who work with adults with disabilities, getting them into the workforce. And so they have two spectrums they work on. One is working with the adults to support them with their disability and finding jobs that are compatible or that they can have the accommodations. And then there's a whole other spectrum of work in working with employers who want to support someone with a disability and have no idea how or don't have the structures. So for me being an able-bodied person, I really pretty much only have to worry about, do I feel like this organization is a good fit versus do I feel like they're a good fit for my skills and do they have the accommodations that I need to be successful? So I think that's a um, something that everyone can think about.
Oh, absolutely. And the other piece of that is that so often employers are like, okay, let me check off the boxes and everything's good.
Right.
You know, is the door wide enough to allow a wheelchair in? Cool. You know, do we allow JAWS technology, which is like a reader for blind people?
Okay.
Um, do we, can we check off those boxes? But the thing is, what actually matters most for a large percentage of people with disabilities, especially the non-apparent ones, is straight up flexibility.
Right.
I mean, one of the huge things is this big push for that return to normal of people having to go into work in person. Working remotely is a huge boon for a huge variety of disabilities for a wide variety of
Yeah.
reasons. And working remotely is something we've been told isn't possible. And that's been the mantra. And then COVID hit, and
Right.
suddenly,
It's worked. Like all these businesses that didn't fail because nobody was in the office. It's like,
right.
and I know people who actually
And
worked harder at home and got more done than they did in the
oh, yeah.
office because there were less stressors, there were less distractions. And so I could see for somebody with a disability that that could be a real factor in not having to constantly go through these triggering stress levels all day long.
Well, absolutely. And then the other part of it too is when you're managing certain kinds of physical disabilities, for you to go to work,
Right.
that can be another set of huge struggles due to the inaccessibility of every step along the way. You need a person to come in to help you get ready for work, potentially. You need to be able to get to work either in a car that's been modified for you to drive or on public transit, which often doesn't isn't as accessible as it's supposed to be and doesn't maintain their
Hmm.
accessibility tools because due to societal ableism, that's very low priority.
Right.
Think about the times you've been on a bus or a train and there's a big like light up thing that's supposed to say what stop you're at and it's not working,
Yeah.
or the audio announcements are incomprehensible.
Hmm.
For an able person, oh well, that's annoying.
Right. But I can
But
see
if
where I'm going and I can say, wait a minute, stop and or pull the little bell or whatever. So,
right.
okay.
And so there's a lot of, getting to work can be a huge energy drain. And then there's all the stressors at work.
Yeah.
And then there's the hours you have to work.
Yeah.
If you have to be there at a certain time, well, if you're dealing with conditions that makes your body less reliable, it's even harder to get in by a certain time.
Right.
You don't have to travel to work. There's usually a little more flexibility on exactly when you start. And even if there isn't, there's fewer things between you and starting
Right.
work. So there's
So
so
there's
many pieces.
a lot for us all to think about. So we just been rolling along in this, and I want to ask you two closing questions. Number one, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners about your growth journey, about um, disabilities in general? And then our final question is, how can our listeners connect with you or follow your work? So we'll start with anything else that you think is important for our listeners to know.
I think flexibility is one of the most important things when it comes to disability. It also will be much nicer for your abled
Mm-hmm.
uh, employees as well.
Mm-hmm.
Almost everything that benefits people with disabilities actually also makes things easier for society. We just have a higher barrier for entry.
Right. Yeah.
Both, and part of that is both the physical, which our society is not good at recognizing, but they're not. But some work has been done, and the ADA does provide a percentage of
Yep.
protections. Um, but there's the whole non-apparent conditions part that is rarely talked about or considered. And so that's all of the people who, like me, and so many people who can't or won't or aren't comfortable or are too ashamed or are too scared. They've got a condition or a set of them, and they can't uh, share what their accommodation needs even are because their workplace is so either so toxic to people with
Mm-hmm.
disabilities or so unaware, or they're afraid of any of being penalized or unemployed due to
Yeah.
the response to their
So
symptoms.
I think there's a
That
responsibility on both sides in terms of the person with the disability feeling comfortable enough to say that, and the able-bodied person to not prod or act in disbelief because you're so quote unquote normal. And
yeah,
so that's a really
and
great
and
message to think about.
and again, abled is your better term
Able.
as opposed to able-bodied,
Okay.
because able-bodied is only focusing again on the physical symptoms
Okay.
and the visible disabilities, and abled recognizes that there's a lot of mental illness which is more stigmatized than the
That's
physical
true.
illnesses,
Right.
even more discouraged from talking about them or recognizing them, which is why a lot of times when I talk about things, I'm very quick to hone in on the invisible illness area.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so abled
Okay.
acknowledges that it's not about your bodily function.
Right. It's
It's
also your
also
cognitive and neurological functions. Got it. Okay. I've
absolutely.
learned a lot today. All right. So how
And
can our, oh, do you have anything else that's important? I'm sure we could go another hour, but
no, no, yeah, no, it's yeah. That's the big thing.
okay.
Just we're we're here, and if you don't know that you know disabled people, it may be because they're afraid to tell you.
Because you said 27% of the people in our country have some
Have
disability that's either seen or unseen. Okay.
yep.
So, how do our
So
listeners connect with you or follow your work?
all right. So I am. My website is thrivingwhiledisabled.com. THRIVINGWHILEDISABLED. And I'm basically some form of thriving while disabled on most of the social media. If you go to my website, you can get links that way. And then the other big thing is my book, Navigating Disability Finances, should be out before the end of the year.
Great.
And that will be available on Amazon and all major retailers.
Well, Alison, I have to say this has been a fascinating conversation, and I have learned a lot just through our talk. And thank you for correcting me with my language, because I know that's really important. And so, for those of you listening, just remember that just what you see isn't always what you see. And how do you be inquisitive and accepting at the same time? Because what you see may not be what you're used to with someone who has a disability. And I think that that's an important part of our conversation. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your time with us today. And you've been listening to the Origination Point podcast. And if this topic, content resonates with you, subscribe, share, and we will see you at our next session. So thanks again, Alison.
Thank you so much for having
Okay.
me.